Hey, what is up guys, and welcome to another Honkai Star Rail video. Alright, in today's Honkai Star Rail video, I'll be discussing the best practices for team building. In this team building guide, I will cover important factors you need to consider when building your teams. These factors include the enemies you are facing, the different roles within your team composition, how to manage your skill points efficiently, speed tuning your characters, team positioning, and finally some example teams at the end to give you all a general idea of how it's done. Whether you're a free-to-play or spender, I believe you all will find this guide useful in some way. And by the end of this video, everyone should have the knowledge and ability to craft well-balanced teams, which in turn will allow you to tackle all content effortlessly, whether it be early game story or the later stages of Memory of Chaos. Okay, let's get started. Alright, let's get started with the most important factor to consider when team building in Honkai Star Rail, and that would be the enemy. Knowing what type of enemy you're up against, whether it's the enemy's weaknesses, what the enemy is resistant to, the enemy's skills and abilities, you should consider all these factors when you're building your team, as it will greatly improve the efficiency and effectiveness of how well your team will do against these certain enemies. For example, if you play towards your enemy's weaknesses, this will allow for more damage when you weakness break them, and can even provide defense and safety for your team. Because every time you weakness break an enemy, it actually pushes the enemy back in turn order. And this is especially apparent in controlling elements such as Quantum right here. This Fire Golem is weak to Quantum, and Ice. Ice is one of the best controlling elements in the game, because you can freeze your opponent and pretty much perma-freeze them, preventing them from ever taking action. There's actually even a strategy which does not involve a healer in the team composition. This team composition usually would include a ice preservation character, whether it's Gepard or March 7th, along with another ice character, whether it be someone like Yang Qing or Pella. And the two other teammates usually are whatever characters that fits the elemental weakness of that enemy. For instance here, it could be a quantum character or a physical character. And the strategy just basically involves cycling through weakness breaks as well as freezes. This in turn will pretty much never allow the enemy to ever take an action, therefore relieving the need for a healer. Of course, this type of team composition can only work if the opponent is weak to ice, so it's very situational, but it has been pulled off before on the previous season of Memory of Chaos. I believe it was floor 10 as well. And of course, you should try to bring a main DPS of an element that matches one of the enemy's weaknesses for the best break results. So for example here, if I were fighting Kafka at the bottom here, my main DPS will most likely be Dan Heng. If I had my Su Sheng built up, she would also be a very viable option. And the main reason why you want your main DPS to match the weaknesses of the enemy is because usually the main DPS does a better job in terms of breaking. My Dan Heng and Su Sheng should easily be able to weakness break the opponent's weakness bar when compared to another character, someone like Natasha for instance. She's only going to be breaking the break bar with her basic attacks. So therefore, just as a general rule, your main DPS should have the matching element with the enemy's weakness. Next, we're going to talk about the enemy's resistances. Enemies in general have a 20% damage resistance to all elements they are not weak to. Basically, whatever they're neutral to, they'll have 20% damage resistance. For the elements they are weak to, for instance, Kafka here is weak to physical, wind, and imaginary, she'll have 0% damage resistance to those elements. On top of that, some enemies will have additional resistances. For example here, Kafka has lightning resistance and frozen resistance. Because of this, Kafka will have a total of 40% damage resistance to lightning, which is quite a bit, so it's probably not a good idea to bring any of your lightning characters if possible. Obviously, if it's someone like your healer or support, then it's fine because they're not doing the majority of the damage, they are just supporting your team with either heals or buffs. Same thing with the frozen resistance. Probably not a good idea to bring any ice characters or any characters that can freeze. So March 7th and Gepard are two characters you probably do not want to bring to this particular fight. And because you're going to be building your teams around the enemy's weaknesses, this means you want good type coverage. In general, you want at least one of each element and no more than 3 of the same element character built early on. Obviously, as we get more characters and banners, there's going to be a point where you're going to have a lot of characters of the same element. So this is more of a suggestion for newer players or players who are still in the early game. This shouldn't really be an issue for anyone, as we do get free characters for pretty much every single element except for imaginary. That is, until we get a free Yukong in patch 1.2. and I guess technically lightning if you missed out on the Serval event. However, there are currently a lot of lightning characters, so odds are you're gonna pull one of them eventually, whether it's Ting Young, Arland, Bailu. There's gonna be even more lightning characters in the future, so I wouldn't really worry too much about that. Alright, on to the next topic, which are going to be the different roles that your characters play within your team. Generally, it is a good idea to build up at least one character from each of the 7 paths, which in turn will allow you to build well-balanced teams with the proper damage, utility, and sustain. To start things off, you're going to have to pick a main character for your team. The majority of the time, this will be your main DPS. Some examples include Zile, who is a very fast character and a very skill point dependent character as well. So you're going to want to pair her with characters that can buff her damage, as well as support her hungry skill point usage. Another example would be Jing Yuan, not nearly as fast as Zile and not as skill point dependent or hungry. In general, you still want to pair him with characters that can buff his damage and characters that can cleanse him as well, as one of the major issues I've had playing Jing Yuan was him getting CC'd by an opponent, and therefore that hinders his damage and stops his Lightning Lord from attacking as well. So it's probably a good idea to pair him along with March 7th or Natasha. Another example of a main DPS that can be your main character is Yang Qing. Due to his kit, there are certain conditions and characters that are needed for his team composition. In general, you want to pair him with characters that can either shield Yang Qing or taunt the aggro away from Yang Qing so he doesn't get hit. Some good examples will be March 7th, Japard, and the Fire Trailblazer. Of course, there's always going to be some exceptions. Some main characters that are not considered main DPS include Clara, who more fits the role of a sub DPS and off tank. Generally, you want to pair Clara with a preservation character, and you usually want to put them next to each other, because this way, if your preservation character or tank ever takes AoE and splash damage, Clara will take some of the damage, and therefore she'll be able to counterattack more often. A good example would be if you paired March 7th with Clara and shielded Clara with March 7th's skill. This will not only give Clara some more survivability, but it also increases the odds of her getting hit. So those two make a very good combination. Silver Wolf is another one of those exceptions that you might want to consider building your team around. Of course, this is Silver Wolf at Eidolon 0. If you have her at Eidolon 6, she can technically be considered a main DPS because she just does a lot of damage. In fact, probably the most damage in the game right now. And the way you're going to build your team around Silver Wolf is basically around the enemy's weaknesses, like stated before. By building your team around the enemy's weaknesses, you're able to manipulate what element Silver Wolf is able to implant on the enemy, making her a very, very useful unit. And the final example of a main character that is not considered a main DPS will be Asta. Generally, if you're using Asta, you want to be playing around her second major trace, which increases the fire damage of all allies when she's on the field. This means that you want to at least have your main DPS be a fire character. You don't have to build a full mono fire team, although that might be possible in the future. So some characters that can pair well with her include Himiko and Hook. Alright, next we're going to talk about the supporting characters. And this will basically include any characters that help your main character perform better or assist them in a role they cannot fulfill. Like for example, if your main character does a lot of high single target damage, but has absolutely no way to do AoE, then you can pair them with a character that can do AoE damage in order to fulfill that gap. Generally, your supporting characters will include buffers, debuffers, and sub DPS. For your buffers, you have Bronya and Ting Young, who are just general damage buffers that will help your teammates do more damage. And in general, they just fit into pretty much any team composition fairly well. Another buffer will be Asta. She's an element specialist that specializes in breaking enemies weak to fire as well as providing damage to your fire characters. She's also technically considered a utility buffer since she's able to provide that speed buff for all your allies with her ultimate. Generally, you won't be using Asta as often as the other two buffers. However, she does have her uses, and in certain situations, she's even better than the latter two. For your debuffers, we have Pella, who provides an AoE defense shred. We also have Welt, who has damage amplification, as well as defensive debuffs in the form of slows and his imaginary break. And of course, we have the recently released Silver Wolf, who basically doesn't let the enemies play the game due to the amount of debuffs she's able to apply on the enemy. And finally, we get to the sub-DPS category, starting off with the Physical Trailblazer, who serves as a 3-target physical breaker. Not the best option and falls a bit short when compared to someone like Clara, but if you need that 3-target physical break, then the Physical Trailblazer is pretty decent. For the next sub-DPS, we have Sampo, who provides single-target DOT damage. And he can apply this DOT damage with just his basic attacks. So overall, a pretty solid sub-DPS, especially if you need that wind coverage. And of course, for the remainder of the sub-DPS, you pretty much have every single one of the Erudition characters with the exception of Jing Yuan. He just does so much damage to the point where people are basically building teams around him as the main DPS. Other than that, Herta, Serval, Qingtre, and Himiko provide good AoE coverage for their element. Alright, now we are finally at the last role, which are your shielders and healers. Currently, there are only 2 healers in the game. As you can see, we only have Bailu and Natasha. Of course, Luocha is just around the corner, and I would highly recommend pulling for him if you like Bailu right here. Not having a healer basically means your team is taking permanent damage. Even if you're running 2 shielders in place of that healer, there are going to be situations where either your shielder is too slow, is impaired or CC'd, or simply just doesn't have the skill points to generate a shield to mitigate damage. That is why, in my opinion, having a healer is much more reliable when compared to shields. For the early game, it's best to run both a healer and shielder for maximum survivability. Basically, the turtle strategy. Obviously, once you reach the point where you need more damage rather than survivability, you can replace your shielder in order to clear the stage faster. For those who are lacking a second healer for your second team in Memory of Chaos, as stated before, you can run 2 shielders instead of that healer. For the majority of the players, it's probably going to be March 7th and the Fire Trailblazer. For those of you who are lucky enough to get Japard, he is definitely a lifesaver when it comes to keeping your team alive in the later stages of Memory of Chaos. Alright, for the next topic, we're going to talk about skill point management. Now, there are going to be 3 different types of characters when it comes to skill point management. There are going to be characters that are skill point consumers, characters that are skill point neutral, and finally, characters that are skill point generators. Examples of skill point consumers will be Zile, Dan Heng to a certain degree, although he can alternate between his basic attack and skill. Su Shang is definitely a skill point consumer, Qingtre as well, especially if you're playing her as a main DPS, and finally, Hook. For characters that are skill point neutral, this means the characters will be using their skill half the time and then their basic attack half the time. Some would include Ting Young to a certain degree, although she's more on the generator side rather than neutral, depending on how fast your main DPS is. Serval can actually be played as a skill point neutral character. Once she gets her shock, she's able to extend it with her ultimate, so she can basic attack the remainder of her turns. Same with March 7th, she doesn't always need to be casting her shield. In some emergency situations, she might be using her skill more often than not, but in general, she is a skill point neutral character. Same can be said for Asta. She doesn't always need to be using her skill. If she has a good amount of her stacks and she has the proper Eidolons, she can occasionally use her basic attack as well. And for Herta, I don't have much experience with her, but based on my knowledge, she is either going to be a skill point neutral character or a skill point generator. The majority of her damage comes from her follow-up attacks, which don't require skill points. And finally, for your skill point generators, these are characters that will be using their basic attack pretty much the majority of the time, and only very situationally using their skill. These characters include the Fire Trailblazer, Natasha, Bailu, Silverwolf to a certain degree, although some people might be using her skill more often than not, but if you do bring her to the proper team, she in general will be a skill point generator. Pella is also a skill point generator as well. You only use her skill whenever you need to remove an enemy's buff, and that's pretty much it for skill point generators. In summary, just make sure you build your teams around enough skill point generators, skill point neutral characters, and only having one skill point consumer, which is usually your main DPS. Alright, next we're going to talk about speed tuning your team. Generally, your character's speed will determine the turn order within the battle. Of course, there are going to be exceptions when your character's action is either advanced forward by a character's skill. For example, if you have Bronya, she can use her skill and advance forward 100% that character she chooses. Or if your character's action is delayed by an enemy, for example, one of the enemies called the Everwinter Shadewalker, which is one of those like ice soldier enemies that you encounter in Jarlto 7. If you get hit by them, they will actually delay your character's action, which gets really annoying, so make sure you kill those guys off first. In terms of speed priority, I would say you obviously would want your skill point generators to be the fastest. So for example, you want your healers like Natasha and Bailu to be one of the faster characters on your team. Next are your skill point neutral characters. For example, someone like March, Serval, and Ting Young. And finally, the slowest characters on your team should actually be your skill point consumers, because they're the ones consuming all your skill points. That is why, for example, it's best to give Zeelay attack boots rather than speed boots, because if you give her speed boots, she'll be so fast to the point where she's going to be consuming skill points faster than the rest of your team can generate for her. Same with characters like Su Shang and Dan Heng. You don't want them to be too fast. They're going to need a certain amount of speed in order to meet certain requirements for relic sets, but other than that, you generally don't want them to be super fast. Alright, and now we're going to quickly talk about team positioning. When it comes to team positioning, you have two different options. You have a defensive positioning option and an offensive positioning option. What I currently have is considered the defensive positioning option, which I highly recommend for most players who are currently in the early to mid game. And what this positioning does is that it actually plays towards the aggro values of your characters. Different characters with different paths will have different aggro values. Preservation being the highest aggro value, followed by destruction. After that will be abundance, harmony, and nihility. And the characters with the lowest aggro value will be your erudition and hunt characters. And for this reason, this is why I have my Fire Trailblazer at the edge here, followed by Natasha, Ting Young, and then Zeelay. This way, if the enemy ever targets my Fire Trailblazer and does some sort of splash damage, instead it will hit Natasha rather than my Zeelay. Now this will be more of an example of an offensive position. For this type of team position, you're trying to generate as much energy for your damage dealers. By placing my Zeelay and Ting Young next to my Fire Trailblazer, the odds of them getting hit by AoE splash damage is more likely. This in turn will allow them to generate more energy for their ultimates, which in turn will also allow my Zeelay to deal more damage, while also allowing my Ting Young to buff my Zeelay more often with her ultimate as well. I would definitely not recommend this for early to mid game players. This is definitely more catered towards the late game players who are trying to get more stars in end game content, such as the Memory of Chaos. Alright, and finally, I'm going to give you guys some example teams. Starting off with the free-to-play team, which features Dan Heng, Natasha, March 7th, and the Fire Trailblazer. Dan Heng is going to serve as my single target main DPS, Natasha is my healer, and then we have March 7th and the Fire Trailblazer as our two shielders and tanks. If you want to go down a more offensive route, you can obviously replace the Fire Trailblazer with someone like Asta, who can provide an attack buff and a speed buff for your entire team. And overall in this team, we have a good balance between a skill point consumer, two skill point neutral characters, and a skill point generator. We also have really good coverage as well. We have wind, physical, ice, and fire coverage. So in general, I'd say this is a pretty balanced free-to-play team. For my next example, this is more of a hyper carry team, featuring Zeelay, Ting Young, Silverwolf, and Bailu. Zeelay obviously functions as the main DPS, Ting Young as the buffer, Silverwolf as the debuffer, and Bailu as my healer. And the goal of this team is to pretty much pump up Zeelay's damage as much as you can, as well as debuffing the enemy's defense, which in turn will allow Zeelay to completely shred through most of the enemies in the game. And this team is also pretty balanced when it comes to skill points. Zeelay is going to be consuming a lot of skill points, however, Bailu is going to be generating a lot of them back, and Ting Young and Silverwolf will generally be either skill point positive or neutral characters. And for the final example, this is what I like to call absolute defense. For this team, we have March 7th, the Fire Trailblazer, Bailu, and Zeelay. March 7th and the Fire Trailblazer will serve as the tanks and shielders. Bailu is obviously my healer, and Zeelay is my main DPS. This is the type of team that early game and mid game players will generally be using to tackle the majority of their content, because the majority of early game players are more concerned about survivability rather than dealing enough damage. The only time you're ever going to need to worry about dealing enough damage within a certain time limit is when you reach the later stages of Memory of Chaos. Okay guys, well that's going to be it for this Honkai Star Rail video. If you guys have any questions regarding team building or if you have anything to add, please let me know in the comments below. And if you guys found this guide helpful, please leave a like, subscribe, or join if you wish to support my channel even further. But other than that, I'll see you guys in the next Honkai Star Rail video. Peace!
my spy? Disappear among the secret butterflies.